They rejected 8 tons of rotten pumpkins, but she turned it into money. Sarah Mitchell had woken up before sunrise for 8 straight months to make that day happen. The day the truck from Valley Distribution Companies would drive up the dirt road, stop in front of the farmyard, and the men would load the crates with the pumpkins she had grown with her own hands. 8 tons. It was the number she repeated to herself when her arms ached, when the rain delayed planting, and when the numbers in the ledger didn't add up. 8 tons that would pay off the debt at the general store, renew the season's contracts, and keep her father's homestead standing for another 2 years. The truck appeared around the bend in the road at 10 in the morning, but it stopped before entering the gate. The foreman got out with a piece of paper in his hand, tossed it over the wooden fence without even looking at her, and climbed back into the cab. Product does not meet standards. Surface blemishes due to weather variations. Batch rejected. Sarah stood in the farmyard with the paper in her hand, staring at the 8 tons of pumpkins piled under a green tarp as the truck disappeared into the dust on the road. The red barn in the background seemed heavier than ever. The horses in the paddock didn't move. The wind covered everything with a silence that hurt more than any words could have. She folded the paper carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her orange overalls, and went to get water from the kitchen. It wasn't time to cry, not yet. The debt at the general store was due in 15 days. Mr. Joe had made it as clear as possible the last time she had gone into the store to get more fertilizer on credit. 15 days. And without the equipment he had lent her throughout the season, the next crop would be impossible. There was no safety net, no savings set aside. There were pumpkins. 8 tons of pumpkins with blemishes on the skin that, according to the technical report from the distribution company, made them unsuitable for the required commercial standard. She read the report 3 times before falling asleep that night. She knew every single one of those pumpkins. She had followed the growth of each bed from the moment the seeds went into the ground. She had gotten up in the middle of the night in July to cover the beds with tarps when the temperature dropped more than expected. She had woken up too early in August to check the irrigation system that kept clogging at the bend of the second bed. She had spent entire afternoons on her knees among the plants, removing pests with her own hands to avoid increasing the cost with products. She knew the blemishes were only on the surface. Anyone who cut one in half would see the orange, firm flesh, with a smell that filled the space with something that only exists when the fruit grows the right way, at the right time, with the right care. But the report didn't look inward. The report looked at the surface, and the truck had disappeared into the dust on the road. Sarah was 30 years old and had inherited the homestead 3 years earlier when her father left. Not suddenly. His health had declined slowly, like the winter that gives warning before it arrives. Her father had had time to sit with her on the porch and say the things that needed to be said, with that calm of someone who had organized their own thoughts for a long time before opening their mouth. He said the land needed respect before it needed work, that a good debt is one that doesn't exist, that the family name was worth more than any harvest, and that if one day she had to choose between the homestead and her dignity, she should choose dignity, because the land could be recovered, but the name could not. He had also said something that she only understood months later, when necessity placed her before choices she never expected to have to make. Sarah, the day pride becomes an obstacle, let it go. The pride that keeps you from asking for help isn't a virtue. It's vanity. You're going to need people. Let them in. She had heard everything with a steady head and a heavy heart, sitting on the same wooden bench where she had sat since she was a child, looking at the same red barn she had seen from the porch for as long as she could remember. When she was left alone at the homestead, she had decided she was going to prove she could do it, not to anyone in particular, to herself, and in a way she wouldn't admit out loud, to him. 8 months of hard work, 8 tons of pumpkins, and a single-line report that undid it all. The first night after the rejection was the hardest. She didn't cry because she had learned from her father that crying doesn't pay the bills, but she lay awake for hours, staring at the kitchen ceiling, with the ledger open on the table and numbers that wouldn't change no matter how long she looked at them. The homestead needed certain resources to function. Without them, the next season wouldn't happen. Without the next season, there was no way to pay off the debt. And without paying off the debt, the homestead her father had built over decades would be at risk. There was a moment in that long night when she thought about calling her aunt who lived in Chicago. Her aunt had inherited her husband's money and had offered help after her father passed. Sarah had said no then. She had said no with the same pride her father had warned her about. And she stared at the phone on the kitchen table for a time she couldn't measure. She didn't call. Not yet. There was one more path to try before that one. She closed the ledger, went to bed and lay awake until dawn. The next morning she tied her hair into a braid, put on the orange overalls, and went out to visit the small grocery stores in town. She carried samples in her hands, explained the situation plainly, and showed the inside of the fruit to anyone who wanted to see. The first store said they didn't work with products that didn't meet visual standards. The second asked if she had a specific invoice for artisan produce, which she didn't have in that format. The third listened to everything, was silent for a moment, and bought a minimal fraction of the stock, enough not to waste her time, but not enough to change anything in the numbers on the ledger. She returned to the homestead with enough money to buy groceries for 3 days. That afternoon, as she looked out at the farmyard with the weight of the day on her shoulders, Sarah wondered for a moment if she had made a mistake in betting everything on that harvest. If it had been too much pride to want to prove she could do it without asking anyone for help. The thought passed quickly. She knew it well. It wasn't time to dwell on what had gone wrong. It was time to figure out what could still be done. But how do you do anything with 8 tons of pumpkin that no one wants to buy? That same afternoon, the neighbor, Mrs. Martha, showed up on the porch. She was over 70, with completely white hair, tied in a loose bun, a face marked by decades in the sun, and the way of walking of someone who's in no hurry because they've seen too much to rush. She brought a bowl of pumpkin soup with smoked sausage and set it on the porch table without ceremony. "Did you make this with mine?" Sarah asked. "With the ones Goldie gave me yesterday morning." They were sitting by the fence. Mrs. Martha had called the pumpkins Goldie since Sarah was a child, and that was one of the many things Sarah had stopped finding strange and started finding natural. Sarah looked at the soup. The color was almost golden, thick and fragrant. There were herbs in it that she recognized from her neighbor's yard, thyme and something else she couldn't quite identify at first. "Mrs. Martha, what am I going to do with 8 tons of pumpkin that no one wants to buy?" The old woman sat down on the wicker chair outside, crossed her arms in her lap, and stared at the farmyard for a moment. Her silence was never empty. It was the kind that carried something inside. "Have you ever thought about selling what you make from them instead of selling them raw?" Sarah didn't answer. She was staring at the barn, calculating, trying to find a hole in reality that didn't exist. "Thanks for the soup, Mrs. Martha." The neighbor stood up slowly, picked up the empty bowl she'd brought earlier, and left without another word. She knew how to wait. She always had. And over 70-odd years, she'd learned that the advice that matters most is the kind a person needs to hear once, tuck it away and figure out on their own how to use it. Sarah was left alone on the porch with the bowl of soup in front of her and the weight of the day on her shoulders. She ate slowly, and as she ate, she looked at those pumpkins with blotches, as if trying to see something in them she hadn't seen yet. In the days that followed, she explored every possibility she could imagine. She tried local market vendors she knew by name. She tried a middleman who'd done business with her father, and who, when he answered the phone, said the market was tough, and he couldn't guarantee a price for off-grade produce. She tried a co-op that was almost 2 hours down the dirt road, and when they finally took her call, told her they didn't accept product from outside their coverage area without prior registration that would take months. Every door she knocked on seemed heavier than the last. At night she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open and the numbers in front of her. The debt wasn't shrinking. The deadline was. The pumpkins in the farmyard were still there, motionless under the tarp, as if waiting for her to make a decision. What she didn't know yet was that the rejection hadn't just been technical. Weeks before the truck showed up on the road, Harrison Reed had sat in an air-conditioned office in the nearest big city and negotiated directly with the managers from Valley Distribution Co. Harrison was in his 40s, with well-groomed dark hair, a suit on a weekday, and a knack for talking business as naturally as other men talk about sports. He owned the largest property in the neighboring region, had grown up in the same kind of rural community as Sarah, and knew every shortcut in that market by heart. The deal Harrison closed in that office guaranteed exclusive supply to the distributor for 1 year, in exchange for a volume only he could provide. The agreement included a stricter visual standard for outside suppliers, a standard that, by calculated coincidence, would reject exactly the type of pumpkins Sarah had grown that season. The surface blotches that an untimely cold night had caused in the beds were precisely the kind of imperfection the new regulation listed as grounds for rejection. Nothing was written linking the two facts. But Harrison knew, the distributor's manager knew, and for now no one else did. Sarah was exactly the kind of grower Harrison didn't want as a competitor, serious, with genuinely quality product, growing slowly, but growing. With a name people in the community respected because of her father, who had farmed that land for decades, and more than anything, with the ability to do more of the same if conditions were right. Harrison had learned over time that the toughest competitors to face aren't the big ones, they're the small ones that grow stubbornly, and once they find the right path, never stop. While Sarah was going around to buyers with samples in hand, Harrison was drinking coffee on his porch, reading the signed contract with quiet satisfaction. On the 12th day before the debt was due, Sarah woke up at 3 in the morning and couldn't get back to sleep. She lay in bed for an hour, listening to the crickets outside and the wind rustling the orchard trees. Then she got up. She went to the kitchen, lit the stove, and started cutting pumpkins. Not out of strategy, not because she had decided anything, but because it was the only thing she could do at that moment without losing her mind. Her hands needed somewhere to go. She cooked the pulp, seasoned it with salt and dried herbs she had stored on a shelf, and blended it in the old blender that had been her mother's. The cream that came out was thick, orange, with a smell that filled the entire kitchen. She tasted it on the spoon while it was still hot. It was good. It was very good. She stared at the pot for a long time. Then she went to get more pumpkins. By the next morning, there were 3 different pots on the stove. A puree seasoned with garlic and black pepper, a jam with brown sugar and ginger, a recipe she had seen her grandmother make when she was 6, and had learned by the memory of her hands without ever writing it down anywhere. And a smoother cream with herbs she had picked from the yard still wet with dew, which had a flavor she couldn't quite describe, but that made your mouth want more. She packed everything into glass jars she had stored in the cupboards over the years, the kind of jars that accumulate in a homestead kitchen without anyone noticing, the fruits of decades of preserves and jellies the women of the family made every season. She wrote the name of each product on a piece of cut paper and tied it with twine. She filled a cardboard box with the jars, put it on the passenger seat of the old pickup truck, and drove to the busiest restaurant in town. The owner was a middle-aged man in a dirty apron, with the look of someone who is always in a hurry and never has enough time for what needs to be done. She waited for him to finish talking to an employee before introducing herself. When he stopped and looked at her, she calmly opened the jars on the counter. "I'm a farmer. I made these products with pumpkins from my harvest. I'd like to present myself as a potential supplier." The man looked at the jars with a stern face. He picked up a spoon from the counter and tasted each item in silence without expression, as if he were fulfilling an obligation. Then he put the spoon down, closed the jars, and pushed the box back toward her. "I'm not interested." Sarah picked up the box, thanked him with a steady voice, and left. She crossed the dirt parking lot, placed the box carefully on the passenger seat, and sat in the pickup truck for a few minutes with her hands on the steering wheel. Her chin didn't tremble. Her eyes stayed dry. But inside there was a heavy weight she couldn't quite name. It was the feeling of having given everything and being pushed back. What she didn't see was the restaurant cook approaching the counter after she left. Carol Henderson was 45 years old, with curly hair always tied back with a rubber band, 20 years in the kitchen that had taught her to distinguish real product from pretty packaging. She had heard the conversation from the back of the kitchen while preparing lunch. She tasted the cream that had been left open with the same spoon the owner used. She stood still. She tasted it again. She stared at the jar for a time she couldn't measure. The owner didn't understand flavor, she thought. He understood price, and sometimes those two things are so different they might as well be opposites. That afternoon, Carol borrowed her sister's car and drove to the homestead. She didn't have the exact address. She stopped at the bakery at the entrance of the community to ask. The baker knew immediately who she meant. She gave the name of the road and added for free that Sarah was the daughter of Mr. Thomas Mitchell, whom everyone in the area knew, and that she was going through a tough time with those pumpkins that Valley Distribution Co. had rejected. Small town. Nothing stays secret for long. Sarah was in the farmyard when she saw the car stop in front of the gate and the woman get out with quick steps. She didn't recognize her right away. "Are you the one who makes these products?" Carol asked, without beating around the bush. "I am. I've worked in the restaurant kitchen for 12 years. The owner doesn't know anything about flavor. He knows about price." She didn't apologize for what she was about to say about her employer. "That pumpkin cream you dropped off this morning is the best homemade thing I've tasted in a long time, and I taste a lot of stuff." Sarah crossed her arms. "Thank you." But the answer was no. The owner's answer was no. "I'm not the owner." Carol looked out at the farmyard, at the green tarp, at the red barn in the background. "How much do you have out there?" 8 tons. Rejected by Valley Distribution Co. because of spots on the skin that are only superficial. Carol was silent for a moment, staring at the pile under the tarp with the expression of someone calculating something others haven't seen yet. "In 3 weeks, there's a farmer's market in Oak Creek. I know the organizers. If you want, I can get you a spot. I've never sold outside the homestead." "Then it's about time." Sarah looked at the woman. There was something in her manner that reminded her of people who make decisions without hesitation and don't usually approach others without reason. "How did you find me?" I asked at the bakery. "I said I was looking for the young woman who tried to sell pumpkin cream at the restaurant. The baker gave me your name and the road." Carol shrugged. "Small town has its perks." "Give me 3 days to think it over," Sarah said. "You have 15 days of debt," Carol replied. "How much time do you really have?" Sarah didn't answer, but in her look, there was a response both women saw. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us beginners a lot. Now, continuing. That night, Sarah went to Mrs. Martha's house. The old woman was sitting on the porch, embroidering something with yellow thread, her face lit by the ceiling lamp that hummed softly when the wind hit the wires. "That advice you gave me," Sarah said, without preamble, "about selling what I've already made with them." Mrs. Martha looked up from her embroidery. "Yes. Did you know it was going to work out?" The old woman was silent for a moment, her needle paused in mid-air. "No." She returned to her embroidery with fingers that knew the path by heart. "But I knew selling raw pumpkin with spots wouldn't work, so the only path left was another one." Sarah pulled up the chair next to her and sat down. "Will you teach me the preserves your mother used to make?" "Mrs." Martha placed the embroidery on her lap, stood up slowly and went inside. She came back with a small notebook with a faded cover, smelling of old cabinet and the time that lingers in things passed from hand to hand within a family. She placed it on the table between them with a care that wasn't just for the paper's age. "This belonged to my mother and my mother's mother before her." She opened it gently. The pages had the uneven handwriting of someone who learned to write late in life, but each recipe was detailed with the precision of someone who knew it would one day need to be read by another person. "I've never taught it to anyone. There was no one to teach." Sarah looked at the pages with a weight in her chest that wasn't sadness but felt like it. "Why are you showing me now?" The old woman was silent for a moment, gazing at the little notebook with the look of someone seeing more than what's in front of them. "Because you have the right hands for this." She closed the notebook carefully. "And because it would stay too still if I left without showing it to anyone." They stayed on the porch until almost midnight. Mrs. Martha talked about preserves, spices, combinations she had carried in her memory for decades without ever having anyone to teach. She talked about how her mother had discovered that ginger cut into thin strips, instead of grated, completely changed the final taste of a jam, about how the exact moment to take the pot off the heat for a preserve made the difference between a product that lasts and one that rots. about how some things seem simple but aren't, and the only way to learn is to mess up until your hands understand what your head hasn't grasped yet. Sarah wrote it all down in a new notebook she'd brought in her hand, in her small, neat handwriting, the same handwriting she'd learned from her father, who said that messy handwriting is just disorganized thinking. When she got back to the homestead, it was almost midnight. She lit the stove before going to bed and made a test batch of preserves with herbs she'd picked from her own yard, following the instructions she'd written down. She sealed the jar while it was still hot, set it on the kitchen counter and went to sleep for the first time in days with something that felt like hope. In the morning, the jar was perfect. She tasted it before anything else. It was good. She called Carol. "You can reserve the spot at the market." The following weeks were full of arms that ached before sleep and woke up already hurting. Sarah processed the pumpkins from 5 in the morning until the light ran out. Seasoned puree, cream with herbs from the yard, jam with brown sugar and ginger that required an exact cooking point. She messed up twice before getting it right, having to dump the batch and start over with patience gritted between her teeth. Preserves with garlic and pepper. The smoother cream she called morning cream, because it tasted like that time of day when everything is still quiet. Mrs. Martha showed up at the homestead every afternoon with something, a different seasoning, a remark about the consistency of a jam that had turned too thick, a way of sealing the jar that closed better. She never asked if she was welcome. She just showed up, observed, said what needed to be said, and left when she was done. One afternoon, Sarah messed up the vinegar ratio in a batch of preserves and had to throw away half an hour of work. She stood in front of the pot with a silence that had anger inside it. Mrs. Martha was on the other side of the counter, sorting jars without looking at her. "Throw it out and start over," the old woman said. "I know I have to throw it out." "Then why are you standing there?" Sarah looked at her for a second. Then she grabbed the pot, went outside, and emptied it into the compost. She came back to the kitchen and started over without another word. Sometimes they would work together in silence for a whole hour without needing to say a thing. Sarah found that comfort strange. She hadn't had that with anyone in a long time. There was something about Mrs. Martha's presence that reminded her of her father, not in her way of being because they were very different people, but in how both of them occupied space without needing noise to do it. On the 10th day before the market, Sarah went to City Hall to get the product sales sorted out. She found out she needed a specific food handling permit that took weeks to get approved. The deadline for her debt with Mr. Joe was in 4 days. The market was in 6. She left City Hall with heavy legs and sat down on a bench in the central square, looking at the people passing by without really seeing any of them. The feeling was like running down a long road without being able to see where it ended. Every time she got close to the end, the road stretched out another stretch. That's when Tyler Brooks said hello. Tyler was 26 years old, the son of the couple who lived 2 kilometers from the homestead and worked as an accounting assistant at a small office in Oak Creek. Sarah had known him since they were kids, when he was the skinny boy who chased after the chickens in his father's farmyard. Now he was a quiet young man with thin glasses and the contained speech of someone who thinks before they open their mouth. "Sarah, are you okay?" "I'm trying." She laid it all out without sugarcoating it. The rejected batch, the debt, the market, the paperwork that couldn't get done in time. Tyler listened to everything with his notebook on his lap, jotting things down in small handwriting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, shuffling through the papers with the air of someone organizing a problem from the inside out before talking about it. "There's a direct sale category for subsistence farm producers, limited volume but completely legal, and the registration process is streamlined. You'd qualify. Does that solve the deadline?" "If you file the application today, yes." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I studied that regulation last semester for a client at the firm who had a similar issue to yours." He adjusted his glasses with a simple gesture. "Sometimes knowledge comes in handy before you even know why you'll need it." They went to City Hall together. Tyler explained the category to the clerk with patience and precision, cited the correct articles, filled out the forms alongside Sarah, and handed everything in before 5 o'clock. The allowed volume was smaller than what she needed to expand, but it was real, it was legal, and it was enough to participate in the market without any trouble. As they left, Sarah looked at him. "I owe you one. Send me a jar of your preserves when they're ready." He gave a half smile. "My mom will be thrilled." There were 2 days left until the debt was due. Sarah went straight to the general store and spoke with Mr. Joe, a 60-year-old man with a grey mustache and the upright manner of someone who built everything he had without asking for favors and never failed to lend a hand when it was deserved. "Mr. Joe, I need 6 more days." The man stood silent behind the counter, arms crossed over his apron, looking at her with that gaze that wasn't cold but was serious. "Sarah, you know I have rules. It's not out of spite, it's out of principle." "I know. But you also know that my father never owed a cent here. In 23 years of buying at this store, he never missed a payment, never broke an agreement, never came with an excuse that wasn't true." She paused. "I need 6 days to go to a market and start selling what I made from those pumpkins. If I don't sell enough, I'll come back and hand over whatever you need. The equipment, anything." Mr. Joe was quiet for a time that felt longer than it was. Then he grabbed his notepad, wrote something down, and placed it under the counter. 6 days. Not 7. Sarah nodded. She shook his hand firmly and left without another word, because sometimes extra words cheapen what was just said. That evening, a message arrived via the son of a neighbor who had passed by the gate and left the folded note stuck in the fence. There was no name, but the sender was clear to anyone who knew the area and its currents. "You're wasting your time. The market you're trying to enter already has an owner." Sarah read the note sitting at the kitchen table with the pumpkin cream still on the stove and the house smelling of spices. She stared at that paper for a long while. She thought about who had written it. She thought about why someone would go to the trouble of sending a message like that if they weren't worried about what she was doing. Worried about a woman on a small homestead trying to sell jars at a countryside market. She folded the note, put it in the pocket of her orange overalls, and went back to stirring the cream. The anger she felt wasn't the kind that makes you cry. It was the kind that makes your hands work faster. The market took place on a Saturday in autumn, with cold wind and a grey sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or not. Sarah woke up at 4 in the morning, carefully loaded the boxes into the old pickup truck, drove to Oak Creek while most of the stalls were still being set up, and the day was still tight on the horizon. Carol showed up to help without Sarah asking. She arrived with a beige linen tablecloth to cover the table, some dried herb sprigs to decorate the sides, and coffee in a thermos for the 2 of them. "You didn't have to come," Sarah said as they set up. "I know." Carol adjusted the sprigs with careful attention. "But presentation matters as much as flavor. I've learned that in 20 years in the kitchen and haven't seen an exception yet. You live a contradiction, you know. You work at a place where the owner doesn't value flavor." Carol gave a quiet laugh through her nose. "Yeah, but the paycheck is on time, and sometimes punctuality needs to be more important than philosophy." They finished setting up the table in silence. The jars were lined up with yellowed paper labels, handwritten, the simple sign with the name of the homestead, and a short phrase, "Made with the land my father planted." The first hours were slow. The bigger booths, with professional setups, colorful printed banners, and refrigeration equipment, drew people in right at the entrance. Sarah's table was in a corner that got less traffic, between a honey producer and a family selling homemade sweets. She stood the whole time, offering samples on little wooden spoons to anyone passing by, briefly explaining what was in each jar with few words and without going on longer than necessary. Most people tasted, thanked her, and moved on. Some bought a jar. No one bought more than 2. By noon, Sarah had sold enough to cover a week's dinners, not enough to pay Mr. Joe. Carol came up from behind with a sandwich wrapped in paper and placed it in Sarah's hand without saying a word. "Don't lose heart yet," she said quietly when Sarah looked at her. "The morning belongs to those who come with a list. The afternoon belongs to those who come with curiosity, and curiosity is what we're after." "Are you sure?" "No." Carol picked up a little wooden spoon from the box. "But that's what I say when I need to believe in something." Sarah ate the sandwich standing up, without sitting down, watching the other booths with the focus of someone who's learning while she waits. She noticed how the olive oil booth drew people with samples placed at the right height, on little wooden spoons, with a piece of bread on the side. She noticed how the honey producer repeated the same 3 sentences whenever someone stopped, sentences chosen to make the customer stay longer. She noticed how the family selling homemade sweets had brought their grandmother, who sat in a chair and drew more attention than any sign because there was an authenticity to her that people look for when they leave home to buy at a market. She didn't have a grandmother to bring. She had the sign, and she had hands that still smelled of herbs from all the accumulated work. And she had the story she'd written on the sign in the handwriting from her account book, with her eyes on the movement of the market. There was a well-dressed woman about 30 yards away who had stopped at an olive oil booth and was tasting with that kind of attention that Sarah recognized. It wasn't the look of someone tasting out of curiosity. It was the look of someone evaluating to buy, to keep buying, to think of others who should also taste. When that woman passed by Sarah's table a few minutes later, Sarah held out a little spoon with cream without waiting for her to stop on her own. Artisan pumpkin cream, made at my homestead. The woman stopped, accepted, brought it to her mouth. She paused for a moment longer than a normal reaction. She tasted again from the spoon that still had a bit left. "Can I see the other products?" Sarah opened each jar slowly, in the order she'd learned to use when presenting, from the mildest to the most seasoned. The woman was around 50, with straight hair streaked with grey at the temples, a posture that comes from someone used to making decisions and bearing responsibility for them. She sampled each product in silence, with that attentive look of someone seriously evaluating. "Can you supply this regularly?" Sarah said yes before calculating whether she could. "My name is Susan Sterling. I have 3 specialty stores in Chicago. For months I've been looking for artisan suppliers with a real identity, not pretty product in expensive packaging, product with flavor and history." She looked at the simple handwritten sign. "Did your father plant that?" "For 23 years. Susan was silent for a moment. "Can I visit the homestead before deciding anything?" "You can visit tomorrow if you want." Susan showed up early Sunday morning, in a beige coat and boots, clearly not made for a dew-wet farmyard. She didn't complain when the mud stuck to the leather. She walked among the still-piled pumpkins, looked at the red barn, looked at the horses in the pen with that gaze that weighed everything she saw. She sampled the products left over from the market, talked with Sarah for 2 hours about process, volume, shelf life, packaging, and seasonality. At the end, she sat at the veranda table with a notepad and pen in hand. "To be safe, I want to start with half the volume you could supply, a 3-month trial contract." "Why half?" "Because I don't know you yet, and jumping in head first without knowing the other person is gambling, not contracting." Susan looked at her with direct eyes. "Prove you're reliable, and we'll talk about doubling the volume." It was enough to pay Mr. Joe. It was more than enough to pay Mr. Joe. Sarah signed with a steady hand and a racing heart that she didn't let show on her face. That night, she went to Mrs. Martha's house. The old woman opened the door, still in her kitchen apron, looking with eyes that already saw before asking. "I did it," Sarah said. Mrs. Martha was silent for a moment. Then she broke into a smile that took time to appear, the kind that comes from a deep place inside and, when it reaches the face, is worth more than any words. "Come in. I'll make coffee." They stayed in the kitchen until late, with the little recipe book open between them, talking about what needed to be produced, in what volume, in what order for the deadline to work. When Sarah left, Mrs. Martha stood at the door with the expression of someone seeing something she had waited a long time for. But the story hadn't finished presenting its obstacles. Far from it. Harrison Reed found out about the contract with Susan 2 days later. It wasn't hard. There was a mutual acquaintance who had seen Susan at the homestead on Sunday and mentioned it in a conversation at the general store without realizing the weight of what he was saying. Harrison made a call to Derek, owner of a small local print shop and packaging supplier. The two had worked together for years, and there was between them the kind of relationship that doesn't need money to be activated because it was built on favors traded over time. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. When Sarah contacted the print shop to order the packaging she had specified in the contract with Susan, Derek said the schedule was full for the next 30 days. 30 days. The first batch had to be delivered in 10. Sarah hung up the phone and stood still in the kitchen with her hand still on the receiver, feeling the weight of that number. 30 days. 10 days. The difference between the two was the difference between a contract honored and a contract lost. Then she called Carol. "The print shop can't handle it. I need proper packaging in 10 days. Carol was silent for a moment, but it wasn't the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone thinking fast. "I know a woman who does handmade paperwork. It's not an industrial print shop, but she produces quality labels and packaging. The cost is higher." "How much higher?" "Almost double." Sarah calculated mentally. The contract would cover it, but the margin she'd planned would be significantly smaller. It would be tighter than she'd anticipated. "Talk to her. I need a proposal by today." The woman's name was Linda, and she worked in a small studio at the back of her house. When Sarah arrived for the meeting, she saw a room full of papers, label samples, hand presses, and the smell of ink that had soaked into the walls over the years. Linda was in her early 50s, with short grey hair and the work rhythm of someone who'd never needed anyone to tell her what to do or when to do it. The result turned out different from what had been planned. The packages were smaller, with a more rustic look, the paper slightly yellowed with labels printed in black and burgundy. They looked handmade because they were. Sarah looked at the samples on the table for a while, and Linda waited without rushing her. "It's more expensive, and it turned out different from what I'd agreed with my client." "I know, but it's what I can deliver in the time frame you need." There was no other way. That afternoon, Sarah went in person to Susan's store, without calling ahead, without sending a photo. She walked in, waited for Susan to finish with a customer, and then placed the packages on the counter. "The original supplier couldn't deliver on time. I found another solution. It's different from what we agreed and more rustic. You decide if you accept it." Susan looked at the packages carefully. She turned them over in her hands. She examined them from different angles with the expression of someone measuring something that goes beyond the immediate visual. She was silent for what felt like a long time. "You know what my customers complain about most in handmade product stores?" "What?" "That it looks industrial. That it looks fake." Susan placed the package on the counter with a decisive gesture. "This looks real because it is real. The rustic look isn't a problem, it's the point." She looked at Sarah. "You can deliver." Sarah returned to the homestead with the strange feeling that things could work out, even when they went wrong in an unexpected way. That sometimes the obstacle pushes you onto a path that was better than the original, one that only became visible after the original plan fell apart. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The first batch was delivered on time. Susan checked every item, verified the consistency of the packages, the expiration dates, the presentation. She approved everything without reservations. But the following week brought a problem Sarah hadn't anticipated: 3 jars of preserves with faulty seals. She discovered this during the final review she did before every delivery, a routine she'd created after a conversation with Carol about the importance of never sending out something that hadn't been checked. It wasn't a large number, but it was enough to compromise the reputation if it reached the customer. She called Susan early that morning before packing the box for delivery. "I need to remove 3 jars from the batch. Seal problem. I'll replace them this week." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You called me before the delivery?" "I'd rather warn you ahead than explain later." Another pause, longer. "All right. I'll wait for the replacement." Sarah redid the production of the 3 jars, delivered them 2 days later with a handwritten note inside the box. No long explanation, no excessive apology, just, "Here's what was missing. Thanks for your patience." Susan kept the note. When the trial contract finished its 2nd month, Susan showed up at the homestead without warning, just like she had on her first visit, as if she needed to see the place again before deciding anything. Sarah was in the farmyard in a stained orange overall, hair in a braid as always, sorting pumpkins alongside Mrs. Martha, who had arrived at breakfast time. "I want to expand the order," Susan said, reaching the fence. Sarah looked up from the farmyard. "There are still 4 weeks left on the contract." "I know, but what you did with those flawed jars told me more about you than 3 months of perfect deliveries ever would. I want to double the volume starting next month." Mrs. Martha, who was crouched sorting pumpkins without seeming to pay attention, said nothing, but the smile on her face was aimed at the ground in a way that tried to hide itself and failed. Sarah said she needed a few days to calculate if the capacity allowed it. With Jacob, the partnership that had begun to take shape, it did. It was that week that Harrison Reed showed up at the homestead. He arrived in a car that didn't match the dirt road, a dark, well-pressed suit, and the confidence of someone who had never needed permission to enter anywhere. Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard the car stop. She dried her hands on the dish towel and went to the porch calmly, without hurrying. "Harrison Reed," he said, as if the name were introduction enough. "I know who you are," she replied. He looked at the farmyard, at the red barn, at the pumpkins that remained in smaller numbers than before. "You've been making noise," he said. "That's an observation, not a compliment." "Did you come all this way to make an observation?" He pulled an envelope from his jacket's inside pocket. "I came to make an offer. I'll buy all your future production at a fixed price per season. The number is reasonable. You eliminate the risk and have a guaranteed income." Sarah took the envelope, opened it, read the 3 pages carefully. The number was in the 4th paragraph. It was reasonable, as he had said. On the last page was the clause she had been looking for since she started reading. Exclusivity of sale, 3 years. She read it twice. Then she folded the contract carefully, as if it was something that deserved to be handled with politeness before being refused. She handed the envelope back. "No." Harrison didn't lose his composure. "You're just starting out. The artisanal market is unstable. You'll face difficulties you can't even imagine yet." "I've already faced difficulties I couldn't imagine." She looked at him with the calm of someone who has been through the worst and is still standing. "Including some you helped create." The man was silent for a moment. No confirmation, no denial. Just the gaze of someone who had crossed the expected line. "Think it over," he said. "I already have." She opened the door back into the kitchen. "Good morning, Mr. Reed." He left in the same dust he had arrived in. Sarah went back into the kitchen and sat in the chair where her father used to sit after dinner. She was silent for a while, looking at her hands. The offer was reasonable in the number, but the clause was a long-term trap disguised as security. 3 years of exclusivity meant handing over control for someone else to decide what to do with it. No chance to grow, no chance to choose new clients, no chance to be what she had started to become. There was no room for doubt. What came were quieter days. Tyler's younger sister, who worked at a natural foods market, mentioned in a family conversation that she had heard Harrison tell an acquaintance that Sarah's products wouldn't last because the setup was amateur. The comment had reached Susan. Susan called Sarah. "I heard what people are saying out there. Does that worry you?" "It worries me when it reaches your ears," Sarah answered honestly. "It already has. What I saw here was a supplier who called me when there was a problem instead of hiding it, and who replaced what was wrong without me having to ask. That answers more than any third-party comment." Sarah took a breath. "Thank you, Susan. It's not gratitude I want. It's next week's batch on time." Sarah laughed. It was the first laugh in a long time that came out without any effort, the kind that doesn't warn you before it arrives. Harrison Reed, through contacts, reached Mr. Joe. A representative from a larger distribution company showed up at the general store with better stock terms, provided the logistical support given to Sarah was withdrawn. Mr. Joe listened to the entire proposal. Then he said something simple. "I have Sarah's contracts in my hand. She paid what she owed and met the deadline. I don't do business that involves harming someone who did that for me." The representative left without the deal. Mr. Joe called Sarah that afternoon. "I just wanted to let you know there was an attempt to pull me away from your side." "And you?" I already told you what I answered. A pause. But you should know that Reed is more bothered than he lets on. That means you're really growing. Sarah was silent for a moment. Thank you, Mr. Joe. No need. Your father would have done the same for me. She hung up and stared out the kitchen window for a long time, thinking about her father, the homestead, the land he had planted for decades, and that was now in her hands. She felt its weight in a different way than before, not as an obligation, as a purpose. It was through Tyler that she found out Harrison had tried the same exclusive contract approach with other producers. The producer who had refused was named Jacob Miller, 55 years old, smaller property, growing pumpkins and zucchini in crop rotation. Since he had refused, he was having trouble moving his produce because the channels he used before were less available. Sarah went to visit him on a Tuesday afternoon. She found Jacob in the farmyard, a man with a grey mustache and hands that seemed made of earth, staring at boxes of pumpkins with nowhere to go, with that expression of someone who has run the numbers more than once, and the result doesn't change. You turned down Reed too, she said. He looked at her with caution that wasn't hostility. I did. The clause was a trap. It was. She looked at the boxes. What do you usually do with the surplus? Sell it to a middleman who disappears when Reed gets involved. Sarah calculated silently for a moment. What if we combined our stocks to handle larger orders? You supplement what I can't produce alone, and we split the logistics. Jacob looked at her carefully. You don't know me. Not much. But you turned down Reed without signing the clause. That tells me something about how you do business. He was silent for a long time. He looked at the farmyard, at the boxes, at the grey sky of that countryside afternoon. Give me a week to think. You have until Thursday, Sarah said with a calmness that wasn't coldness. Because on Thursday I confirm the volume for Susan, and I need to know if I can count on you or not. Jacob nodded. Sarah left without hurry. She knew he would call before Thursday. When a person who works the land turns down a bad deal on principle, that person usually recognizes a fair deal when it shows up. He called on Wednesday afternoon. I'm in. The partnership happened simply. They combined their stock, defined the division by product type, established how the value would be split at the end of each delivery. No official paperwork. Based on a given word, as her father had taught her, business is done when you truly trust. Mrs. Martha found out about the partnership one afternoon when she went to the homestead and found Jacob talking with Sarah on the porch. She studied the two of them with a look that saw more than it seemed. She made coffee for the three of them without anyone asking. When Jacob left, she came into the kitchen with the cups. He can be trusted, she said. Do you know him? I've known his father since before you were born. The old woman washed the cup in the sink. A family that works honestly has a different way about them. Sarah looked at her. You always know things that other people don't. No. Mrs. Martha dried her hands on the towel calmly. I just pay attention to the things other people don't. Important difference. With the combined production of the two, the volume reached Susan with a consistency she hadn't achieved before. And it was exactly at that moment that Raymond Vance entered the story. He showed up on a Tuesday morning at Susan's store in a well-cut dark suit. He was around 38 years old, dark hair, a direct way of speaking. He was a buyer for a regional chain of specialty stores that sold to a higher-income audience in Chicago. Susan had saved some of Sarah's products specifically for this visit, without telling Sarah she was doing it. Raymond tried each item with professional attention, stayed silent for a while, the silence of someone forming an opinion that mattered. Who produces this? He asked. A female farmer 40 minutes from here. Susan crossed her arms with quiet satisfaction. Want to visit the homestead? Raymond showed up the next day. He arrived in his suit and shoes that were definitely not for the farmyard. He looked at the pumpkins, at the red barn with the autumn trees in the background, at the horses in the paddock. He looked at Sarah with the gaze of someone evaluating, without letting the evaluation show on his face. How long would it take you to triple your production capacity? Sarah held the question carefully before answering. Depends on the available investment. How much do you need? I need to know how long you're willing to wait before I answer that. Raymond kept looking at her. Then he gave a smile that was the first since he'd arrived. Let's talk." The negotiation took weeks. There was a huge gap between what she could produce now and what the contract would require. She needed a covered processing area, basic equipment to handle a larger volume, capacity she didn't have. Tyler analyzed Raymond's contract and showed that he himself could be used as collateral for a rural loan. "Does that really work?" Sarah asked. "It works. I used it for a client last year successfully." She stayed silent. She had grown up hearing her father say that good debt is the debt you don't have. She had inherited his way of thinking along with the homestead. "How much would I need to take out?" She said the number. Tyler calculated. "With Raymond's contract as collateral, you can get it, but you'll start next season with a number on the liability side." Sarah kept looking out the kitchen window at the farmyard, at the barn, at the place where 8 tons of pumpkins had rotted while she looked for a way out that seemed not to exist. Start the process. Her pride had held out for days before giving in, and when it gave in, she understood that giving in wasn't weakness. It was maturity. It was the difference between what her father had taught and what she had learned on her own over the months that had passed. The loan was approved with restrictions, covering enough for the covered processing area and essential equipment. The construction started on a Monday with workers from the community, whom Sarah knew by name. Harrison found out about the construction before it was finished. He tried, through a contact at the material supplier, to delay the delivery of supplies. But Tyler discovered the maneuver before it could cause any real damage. The delivery was kept on schedule. There was a growing sense in Sarah that every step she took created a new obstacle she hadn't planned for. But she had learned something over those months. The obstacle wasn't the end of the road. It was the point where the road changed direction, and she had learned to change along with it. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. It was 1 week before the first big delivery to Raymond when the storm hit. It wasn't announced with enough warning. A cold front that shifted direction during the night and turned into heavy wind and rain before any warning could get there in time. Sarah woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of wind hitting the roof tiles, a sound different from normal, deeper, more urgent. She ran to the farmyard. The processing area had taken damage to the roof. A part of the side structure had given way under the wind's pressure. The equipment that still didn't have proper cover was exposed to the rain coming in through the open side. She spent the rest of the night at the homestead trying to save what she could, alone in the rain with a flashlight in one hand and tarps in the other, soaked from the very first minute, her braid plastered to her face and her feet sinking into mud that was forming too quickly. When morning broke grey and quiet, the rain had stopped, but the damage was clear under the cold morning light. Sarah stood still in the farmyard in her wet clothes, her eyes fixed on the compromised structure. She calculated what was left. The equipment had survived, the processed product was intact, the structure needed urgent repair. Then she picked up the phone. She called Carol first. "I need help." Carol showed up in less than an hour, with tools she had borrowed from her husband, and the expression of someone who hadn't come to ask how big the problem was. She came to fix it. Jacob arrived soon after with his family, 2 kids and a brother-in-law, who knew construction and had brought the right tools without needing anyone to ask. Tyler came with repair materials he had gotten through phone calls made on the way. Mrs. Martha arrived last, with coffee in a thermos and bread she had made early that morning, and she served everyone without anyone asking, with the calm of someone who had seen enough storms to know that after the wind comes the work, and after the work comes what was saved. In 2 days, the structure was functional again, not perfect. There were marks from the storm that would take longer to fix, but functional. The equipment had survived. The product was intact. When the last nails were hammered and the last tarp tied down, everyone stopped for a moment in the farmyard, with the kind of exhaustion that only appears when the urgent work is done. Jacob's brother-in-law was cleaning the tools. Jacob's kids stood drinking Mrs. Martha's coffee, their backs against the fence. Tyler was jotting something down in a notebook with the expression of someone already planning the next step. Sarah looked at each of them. At Carol, who had shown up without being called. At Jacob, who had brought his entire family without asking if it was needed. At Tyler, who had dropped everything he was doing. At Mrs. Martha, who had served coffee to everyone as if it were the most natural thing in the world, because for her it was. She had grown up hearing her father say that no one gets anywhere alone. She had spent the last few years trying to prove she could make it without needing anyone. And she had needed the storm to understand that both things could be true at the same time, that making it wasn't the same as making it alone, and that being able to accept help was just as hard and just as necessary as any other skill she had developed. "Thank you," she said to everyone without looking at anyone in particular. "To each of you." No one replied with words. There was no need. On the third day, Sarah called Raymond before making the delivery. "There was a storm that damaged the structure. I'm delivering the batch one day late. If this is a problem for the contract, I need to know now." A pause on the other end. "You called me before the delivery." "I always prefer to warn beforehand rather than explain afterward." Another pause, longer this time. "One day is no problem. I'll expect the batch tomorrow." The pickup truck stopped at Raymond's store with the boxes the next morning. He was waiting in the warehouse. He checked each product carefully, inspecting the packaging, the expiration dates, the consistency, the scent. He approved without any reservations. "The look of the packaging is different from the standard I usually work with," he said. "I know. It's truly handmade." He stared at one jar for a moment, turning it over in his hands attentively. "My customers are going to ask if it's real." He placed the jar back in the box carefully. "Now I can say yes for sure." The contract was expanded that week. Raymond signed without lengthy negotiation. He said the lot had reached the client 2 days later and that the feedback had been better than expected. He also mentioned, almost in passing, that the fact she had called to warn about the delay before the delivery was the detail that convinced him he was doing business with the right person. The news of the contract with Raymond's network reached Harrison through the same channels he had used to try to block it. The distribution company that had rejected the pumpkins months earlier learned that that same produce had turned into a high-acceptance product in a market it hadn't reached. That the rejection report had been the starting point of a journey that was now hard to ignore. The manager who had tossed the paper out the truck window showed up at Sarah's homestead one morning, this time getting out of the vehicle and waiting to be received at the fence. She saw him arriving from the porch and didn't hurry her step. He reached the fence with an envelope and a supply request. The distribution company had renegotiated the exclusivity terms with Harrison after the entry of handmade products into the local market showed that excessive standardization was driving away a growing segment of customers. "I want to make a supply proposal," he said, with a different tone from that morning when he had tossed the report out the window without getting out of the truck. Sarah received him on the porch with 2 glasses of water. "I'll listen." She listened to the proposal with full attention without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. "I need a few days to evaluate. My current contracts take up most of my capacity. Any new agreement needs to fit within what I can deliver without compromising those who already depend on me." The manager left the envelope with the terms on the porch table and left with a nod of his head that was more humble than anything he had done in that story up until then. Sarah stared at the dirt road for a moment after the car disappeared. She thought about that morning when she had stood still with the report in her hand, looking at 8 tons of pumpkins that no one wanted. She thought about how far she had walked since then. Then she went to the kitchen and put water on to boil. It was coffee time. She talked to Tyler about the terms of the proposal. The result was a counter-proposal with a smaller volume than the original request, but it was the real volume she could maintain consistently without harming any of the previous contracts. The distribution company accepted. Harrison received the news in silence. The rival he had tried to eliminate had grown around every obstacle he had created. And every obstacle she had turned into a new direction. She had lost. There was nothing to say about it that he wanted to say out loud. The end of that season came with numbers that Sarah hadn't dreamed of when it all started. The debt to Mr. Joe had been paid off for months. The processing area was functional and covered. Jacob had formalized the partnership in a simple agreement that Tyler had drafted, and that the two of them had signed on the kitchen table with Mrs. Martha as a witness. The old woman had signed with a trembling hand, and pride she didn't try to hide. Carol received a basket every week, free of charge and without a contract, because some debts are paid with a gesture, not with paper, and they are greater than any number on a page. Mrs. Martha had started working on peak days as a paid collaborator, selecting the herbs, guiding the recipes, ensuring that the standard of flavor she had helped build was maintained in every batch. She had refused payment twice with the stubbornness of someone who hadn't come for the money. On the third time, Sarah had placed the envelope on the table without asking. "I didn't come here for the money," Mrs. Martha said. "I know that's exactly why I should pay." Sarah looked at her firmly. "You do real work. Real work gets paid." Mrs. Martha was silent for a moment. Then she picked up the envelope. On the day Raymond returned to the homestead to sign the annual contract, he arrived late in the morning in the dark suit she had already learned to recognize from afar by his pickup truck on the dirt road. Sarah was in the farmyard sorting pumpkins when he got out of the car. Raymond got straight to the point, as he always did. "The first year went well beyond what I expected. I want to contract annual supply with a fixed volume and a semi-annual review clause if the market grows as I'm projecting." "Without exclusivity," Sarah said before he could open any document. Raymond looked at her. "Without exclusivity," he confirmed. "It's not my way of working." She was silent for a second, as if she needed to confirm she had heard correctly. Then something in her face softened slightly, not a full smile, but the beginning of one. "You can open the contract." They went to the porch. Tyler was already waiting. He analyzed every clause carefully while Raymond sat waiting unhurriedly, his gaze sweeping over the farmyard, the barn, the horses in the paddock, as if he were reading the place while he waited. The negotiation was brief. Both parties had arrived with clarity about what they needed and what they wouldn't give up. Sarah signed with the pen that had been her father's and that she kept in a kitchen drawer. A simple pen with a blue cap, old enough that the ink was a little dried out. She refilled it when needed. She had never thought of throwing it away. Raymond signed on the opposite side. Then he took an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and placed it on the porch table with a simple, direct gesture. The advance on the annual contract. Sarah looked at the envelope. She picked it up with hands that still smelled of the earth from the farmyard, with the orange stains that the pulp leaves on the palms when the harvest goes into the hand before it goes into the pot. She hadn't thought about washing her hands before signing the contract, and she hadn't regretted not washing them. Raymond had noticed. He said nothing. She held the envelope and looked out at the farmyard, at the horses in the paddock grazing with the tranquility of those who have nothing to prove, at the red barn with the autumn trees in the background, the orange and ochre leaves that had arrived without warning, and covered the ground under the trees in a carpet of colors that strangely matched the pumpkins stacked on the left. To the place where, months earlier, 8 tons of pumpkins had been piled up under a green tarp while the truck from Valley Distribution Co. disappeared into the dust of the road, and a one-line report said there was nothing to be done with them. There was. There always was. Sarah breathed deeply. The air smelled of earth and spices, and the old wood of the barn. It smelled of everything she had inherited from her father, and everything she had built with her own hands since then. It smelled of the work that doesn't give up when the door closes, that looks for the window, that, when the window is shut, learns to build a new one. She said nothing. Mrs. Martha, who had been sitting in the shade of the porch throughout the entire negotiation, with a cup of coffee in her lap and the little recipe book closed beside her, slowly stood up after Raymond left. She went to the edge of the porch and stood looking at the farmyard for a moment. "You know what your father would say, don't you?" she said without turning around. Sarah remained silent. "He'd say it served you right," she finally replied. "He'd say more than that." Mrs. Martha turned, her gaze serene like someone who has walked far enough to know what matters. "He'd say you were the one who did it." Sarah stared at the old woman for a long moment, at that woman over 70 who had appeared on the porch with a bowl of soup on a day when the world seemed closed, who had opened a little recipe book she had never shown anyone, who had showed up every afternoon uninvited and stayed silent when silence was more useful than any word. "Thank you, Mrs. Martha." The old woman nodded with that slow nod of someone who receives thanks like they receive coffee, without ceremony and with ease. Then she picked up the little recipe book from the porch table, placed it slowly into the straw bag she always carried, and walked off down the dirt road with the steps of someone who is in no hurry because she knows where she is going. Sarah stayed on the porch until she disappeared around the bend. Then she looked at the envelope still in her hand. At the farmyard, at the barn, at the place where months ago everything had seemed lost. Some things don't need words when your hands are already full of proof. End of story. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. Leave in the comments how you felt seeing Sarah overcome everything. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It helps us a lot.